All right, today we're tackling a question that's, well, it's deeply personal for so many of us, and it's a massive puzzle for science. Why is addiction so hard to understand? We see its effects everywhere, right? But the actual why of it all can feel so incredibly out of reach. So let's dive in and see if we can start piecing these clues together.
Here it is, this central mystery. I mean, think about it. One major survey found that nearly half of all high school students have tried alcohol, and yet only a tiny fraction of them ever go on to develop what we'd actually call an addiction. So, if the substance itself isn't the only thing to blame, what else is going on? This very question is the launchpad for our entire explainer.
Okay, to really get a handle on this, it's super helpful to split the theories into two big buckets. Think of them as different kinds of clues in a detective story. On one hand, you have etiological theories. These are all about the origin story, what causes addiction to even start. Things like your family history or past trauma fit right in here. And then, on the other hand, you have sustaining theories. These explain what keeps the addiction going once it's already there. Understanding this difference, what starts it versus what keeps it going, is absolutely crucial to solving this puzzle.
So our first clue, it takes us deep, deep inside the human brain. You know, there's a reason the American Society of Addiction Medicine actually defines addiction as a disease of the brain, specifically of its reward and motivation systems. So let's put on our neuroscientist hats for a minute and take a look at what's happening in there.
So the brain talks to itself using these little chemical messengers called neurotransmitters. And when we're talking about addiction, the absolute rock star, the main character, is dopamine. Dopamine is the chemical of pleasure, of reward. It's that, wow, that felt amazing, let's do that again chemical that our brain releases when we eat something delicious or finally hit a big goal.
Right, so where does all this dopamine action happen? It's in a part of the brain called the mesolimbic pathway, or a much easier way to think of it, the reward center. Picture it like a superhighway for pleasure. When a person uses certain substances, that highway gets absolutely flooded with way more dopamine than it's used to, creating this intensely pleasurable feeling that the brain is just hardwired to want to experience over and over again.
But here's the thing. Brain chemistry isn't the whole story. Not even close. For our next clue, we have to shift from the physical brain to the mind. Because our personal histories, our pasts, and our inner emotional worlds, they play a massive, massive role in all this. Now, this is a really profound idea. Attachment theory basically suggests that our earliest relationships, with our caregivers, they create a blueprint for how we connect with people for the rest of our lives. So if those early bonds were shaky or insecure, a person might really struggle to form healthy connections with other people. And this is how a substance can sneak in and become a kind of substitute, a reliable, predictable attachment when human connection feels scary or just isn't there. And that brings us to another key psychological clue, the self-medication hypothesis. It's so common to hear people with substance use disorders say that the first time they used, they felt whole for the first time, or like some deep void inside was finally filled. This theory suggests that maybe addiction isn't so much about chasing pleasure as it is about running from pain or trying to patch up a feeling of being incomplete. It's a tragic, misguided attempt to self-soothe.
Okay, so we've looked at the brain, we've looked into the mind. Now let's zoom out even further and look at the environment, specifically the family. Because, a person doesn't exist in a vacuum, and family dynamics can create this incredibly powerful system that often, completely unconsciously, works to keep an addiction locked in place.
It's fascinating, really. In families that are struggling with addiction, people often fall into these surprisingly predictable roles just to cope with the chaos. You've got the hero, the overachiever who makes the family look good from the outside. Then there's the scapegoat who's always in trouble, drawing all the attention away from the real issue. And of course, the lost child, who just tries to become invisible so they don't add any more stress. And what's wild is that each of these roles, in its own strange way, helps keep the family in a kind of dysfunctional balance, allowing the addiction to just continue.
And this is exactly how families can get trapped in what's called a negative feedback loop. Take this classic example. Parents nag their son because he drinks. But if you ask the son, he says, well, I drink to get away from all the nagging. And the result? A total stalemate. Nothing changes. The pattern of communication itself is now part of the problem, creating a cycle that is incredibly hard to break from the inside. So let's recap. We have our biological clue, our psychological clue, and our systemic clue from the family. But here is the absolute most important takeaway from all of this. None of these clues tells the whole story on its own.
The real answer to our puzzle is found in how they all fit and interact together. And that is where this bigger, more complete framework comes into play, the biopsychosocial model. I know, it's a mouthful, but it's exactly what it sounds like. It's the model that says, hey, you have to look at everything at once. It forces us to integrate all our clues, the biological stuff, like genetics and brain chemistry, the psychological factors, like trauma and personality, and the social elements, like family and your environment.
Now, a really great way to see this whole biopsychosocial thing in action is with something called the diathesis stress model. First, you have diathesis. It sounds complicated, but it just means a pre-existing vulnerability. This could be biological, like a family history of addiction, or it could be psychological, like an early trauma. Then life happens, and stress hits, a triggering event, like losing a job or a tough breakup. And it's the interaction between that vulnerability and that stress that can result in a disorder. And this explains so much, right? It's why two people can go through the exact same horrible event, but only the one with that underlying vulnerability goes on to develop an addiction.
So after all of this, after digging into dopamine and family dynamics and everything in between, we land on this incredibly important and I think hopeful conclusion. Our brain chemistry, our genes, our past, they create vulnerabilities, for sure, but they do not write our future in stone. And that's the final thought I really want to leave you with. If our biology isn't our destiny, what does that mean? Well, understanding this whole complex web of factors doesn't erase personal choice, but it absolutely reshapes how we understand it. It opens the door for so much more compassion, and it highlights that while our biology might constrain our choices, it doesn't destroy them. And right there, in that space, that's where the profound possibility for change and recovery truly lies.